So my name is Sahib Khalsa. I'm an assistant professor at TU in the Oxley College of Health Sciences. I'm also a principal investigator here at the Laureate Institute for Brain Research. I'm a psychiatrist and a neuroscientist. I've received training in both disciplines. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about a topic that I think is probably near and dear to everybody's heart in some way or another. So the title of my talk is When Food Rules the Brain. So I'm a psychiatrist. I don't have any disclosures, financial or otherwise, for this talk. One other thing to keep in mind is that during this talk, there will be some food pictures. There will also be pictures of bodies. So for those of you who haven't eaten dinner yet, it might make you hungry. The other thing is, thank you so much for coming here despite the severe thunderstorm warning. There's no doubt that modern humans have a somewhat complex relationship with food. There's a historical precedent for this relationship. So if you think about, for the vast majority of human history, in order to survive on a day-to-day basis, humans relied on near daily hunting and foraging to obtain food. So here's an artist's depiction of some coordinated hunting. So you have the person who's going to shoot these wild boar, and you've got coordinated teamwork. You can see that this is in somewhat of a remote area, so probably not in your living room with a refrigerator, probably not even within a few hours, maybe even a few days of home. Okay? So if you think about the amount of energy that people used to expend on acquiring food, it was pretty intensive. So here's a few cartoons poking some fun at these sort of prehistoric careers. So here's the Swami on the mountain, the caveman asking about the meaning to life, and he says, nope, there isn't any more to life. Hunt, gather, that's pretty much it, right? Here's somebody who wants to do something different with their life, and the choice is only hunter-gatherer or hunter-gatherer. What is this accounting thing, right? So, but over time, there's been sort of an evolution away from that perspective. There's really only one remaining tribe of humans that still live up to this hunter-gatherer society. So this is the Hadza tribe in Tanzania in Africa. This is the last remaining group of humans who spend the vast majority of their time hunting and gathering to acquire food. And a study estimated that about 95% of the calories that they consumed were related to foraging. So they'll gather these berries, they'll do some hunting, they'll eat wild honey from beehives that they find. We'll return to the Hadza in a little bit later in the talk, but it's just sort of interesting to get this sort of real-world comparison to our prehistoric ways of obtaining food. So with the advent of agricultural and domestication techniques, the reliance on hunting decreased. So here's one depiction of some farming practices. So you can see the impact of tools. You have a scythe here to collect the wheat. You've got domesticated animals over here, right? Some cows that are being raised, maybe for meat or maybe for milk. You've got the domestication of animals in other ways. So a dog to maybe protect you, but also to protect the livestock. And you've got various tools associated with refining and processing the food. In some cases, maybe even for storage. So this kind of lifestyle change resulted in different types of diets over time. So here's an example of the Kyrgyz in the mountains of northern Afghanistan. So this is an example of humans alive today who have a sort of farming-like diet. They don't grow any crops, but they raise livestock, and they're completely dependent for all of their caloric needs on the byproducts of the animals themselves, or anything that they can trade associated with that. And this is quite different from another sort of diet and lifestyle. So people in Crete, which is the largest island in Greece, who eat a much richer variety of foods drawn mainly from farms and from the sea, so not as much necessarily, yaks and things like that, but certainly more vegetables. And so we won't talk any more about sort of the potential impact of these different diets on health or brain foods, or different fad diets that you may have heard about, like the Atkins or the Paleo or the South Beach, etc. Gluten-free, high-protein, low-fat, low-protein, or Mediterranean, right? But I think it's interesting to reflect historically on the role that food and the way that humans have gathered and gained food over the millennia when we start to think about how we relate to food in modern times. For example, does this look familiar to anybody? So nowadays, your typical hunting and gathering might look like going to Reesers and going down aisle upon aisle of as much food as you could possibly imagine and more. If you don't want to go to Reesers, then you could go to Sprouts, you could go to Whole Foods. Now you could even go to Trader Joe's here, which is great. So we have literally an unlimited supply of food, and not just any kind of food, but food from cuisines from all over the world. If you want to have Italian food for lunch, and you want to have Chinese food for dinner, and you want to have Indian food the next day, flapjacks for breakfast, you can do it. Okay. And so this is kind of, this abundant access has led in some ways to a fair amount of preoccupation with eating. So in the media, you may have come across TV shows like this. So this is a still from MTV Cribs, where celebrities are showing the houses that they live in. And one of the most famous segments is when the celebrity opens the fridge and shows what kind of food they have. And oftentimes you'll see these lavish, kind of these large refrigerators with lots and lots of food, and everyone has a different amount and type and organization of food. You have cooking shows devoted to food, where you have to, chefs have to compete. So this is Iron Chef, right, to create any kind of food combination in a short amount of time, and oftentimes there are mystery items. You also have eating competitions. So any of you recognize the Nathan's hot dog? I think the person who won the competition this year, I think Joey Chestnut, I think he ate 72 hot dogs in 5 minutes or something like that. I mean, it's hard to imagine. And the records keep going up. Something a little bit closer to home. Has anybody ever been to this restaurant or heard of this restaurant? So this is the Big Texan in Amarillo. So if you're on Route 66 and you stop in at this restaurant, they have a 72-ounce steak that they'll serve you if you request it. And if you can finish it in one sitting, your meal is free. 72 ounces, though. It's about this big. I don't think they've ever had anyone successfully complete that challenge. Okay? So hard to imagine a prehistoric hunter-gatherer being confronted with this kind of situation, right? How would they respond? So in some ways, it's in the context of this abundant access to food that in Western civilizations, especially the United States, we're experiencing an obesity epidemic. And it seems like one of the clearest links so far, it relates to increased caloric intake and decreased physical activity that result in increased body mass, right? So here you can see that the size of Homo obesitus, or whoever this is larger, both in terms of proportions, but also in terms of weight. And there are ways that we have set about trying to characterize these changes. So that's using the body mass index. Has anybody, if you've heard of body mass index, just raise your hands. So at this point, pretty much everybody's heard about it. It's a simple formula. It's your weight in kilograms or divided by your height squared in meters, and there's a conversion if you're using pounds and feet. And when you do that, you can derive numbers, and we've applied labels to these numbers, right? So currently in the classification system that we use, we consider a healthy weight to have a certain number, 18.5 to 24.9, and when the number gets above that, within a certain range, you are categorized as overweight, and even higher, obese, and the numbers are the same across males and females, and you can see some sort of pictograms of some different body types that might be associated with these classes. Has anyone heard of any problems with the BMI in terms of using it as a unit? Yeah. Exactly. So you can have the same BMI, but a very different beach body, right? So this was a rendering that the New York Times did a story on last year. So apparently this firm specializes in scanning people's bodies so that if people want, they can order clothing that is custom sized to their body shape. And what they did is they took one person, or actually they took 6 people, all who had the same BMI, but who had different body proportions. So all of these people have the same BMI number. In this case, I think they're very, very, very slightly in the overweight category. But you can see that there are some substantial differences in aspects of their body proportion, right? An extreme example of this would be like a bodybuilder, right? Arnold Schwarzenegger in his prime, hulking and full of muscle, might have a BMI that's somewhere in the obese range, when in fact his body fat would have been well below normal. So in truth, there are other ways that we measure body mass, and we can look at things like waist circumference, we can look at things like body fat percentage. But when you talk about research studies and sort of the way that psychiatric disorders are classified, because those measures have not been commonly applied, what you see is a reliance on this number, the BMI. For one thing, if you're going to measure body fat percentage, you need an expensive instrument, much more expensive than a bathroom scale. Sometimes you can measure skin folds and sort of the size, et cetera, and the weight of that, and that's somewhat discomforting and invasive for people. So at this point, I would say that we rely on this number, but it's actually an imperfect representation of what's going on. So with that said, we're going to talk a little bit more about BMI and how that might relate to health. So if you go to the website of the National Institute of Health, you'll see, again, this categorization. So underweight, normal, overweight, and obese. And actually, over time, they've had to add several categorizations onto obesity because we have, as a country, increased over time. So there have been more and more obese people. So you have these sort of obesity class 1, 2, and 3. And when you look at how that relates to certain kinds of health conditions, so risk for physical conditions like type 2 diabetes, hypertension, and cardiovascular disease, which puts you at risk for strokes, heart attacks, you can see that as the BMI goes up, the risk to health goes up in both men and women. And so even though it's an imperfect metric, it's probably going to be here for a long time, and it has some relationship to physical risk factors for illness. One thing that's missing, you'll notice, is that there's nothing listed here for this underweight category, so I want you to just keep that in mind, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. We're going to focus a little bit more on obesity, and what I'm going to show you is some rapid time travel. So this is some information from the Center for Disease Control relating to the percentage of individuals in the United States who self-reported a BMI in the obese range. So basically, a BMI greater than 30. And so every year, as a part of this survey, they would call up a representative sample of people throughout every state in the country and say, okay, Mr. So-and-so, what's your height and weight? Mrs. So-and-so, what's your height and weight? And so in 1985, you can see that most states were, either had no data or were kind of in the mild range, less than 10% or 10 to 15%. And so we're just going to fast forward, and I want you to just take a look for yourself and see if you notice anything change over time. So 92, 93. 2002, 2004. There's Oklahoma. All right. So pretty remarkable, right? This is real data. This is real data from people self-reporting what their weight and their height are over time. In 1990, no state had an obesity prevalence that was greater than 15%. In 2010, no state had an obesity prevalence less than 20%. So, and that was 6 years ago. They've actually changed some of the ways that they code the data. So I can't show you a time lapse up to 2016, but the 2016 map looks even hotter, if you will. 12 of these states, including Oklahoma, had an obesity prevalence that was greater than 30%. So almost 1 out of every 3 people meeting the criteria for obesity. If you look at the trend a different way, so these are the different study epochs or study periods, and you can see that in 1960 or 1962, across the United States, you had about 10%, a little bit more men versus women. And then you can see, as they go from 70s, mid-70s, late 70s, 80s, 90s to 2000s, you can see this just dramatic rise. And if you think about how long humans have been eating food, and you think about the rate of this rise, it's really stunning, and it has to make you wonder, like, what's going on? What's happening in terms of people's bodies? What's happening in terms of people's brains? What's happening with society in a way? So one question that you might wonder is, well, Dr. Khalsa, you're talking about prehistoric people, hunter-gatherers. All they did was they spent their time hunting and gathering, and they were very physically active. Maybe they just needed to burn more calories, and now we're no longer, we don't have as much caloric needs. So people have actually looked at this, and remember the Hadza tribe from northern Afghanistan? So this is a map, a graph looking at an index of daily energy expenditure, which you could think of as the amount of calories that somebody burns relative to how heavy or how big their body is. And there's a general relationship in Western civilizations that the larger you are, the more caloric needs you have. That's why men versus women, men tend to be larger. They can have a higher daily caloric intake. Well, for the Hadza, they have the same relationship as their Western counterparts in gray. So that takes that explanation away. I would ignore the blue. That's related to a subgroup of farmers in South America that have been found to have different metabolic rates related to genetic reasons. So if the metabolic rates really haven't changed over time, what about food intake? Right? So One thing that's for sure is that since the 50s, the amount of food that restaurants have been serving us has just stratospherically increased. I mean, if you look at the average size of a hamburger now, it's 12 ounces versus a 4 ounce. Remember, the all-you-can-eat steak at the Big Texan is a 72 ounce, so you're still not going to get anyone, I don't think, in this day and age that'll be able to finish it. But clearly, the amount of food that shows up on your plate when you order from a restaurant is larger. And if you're one of those people who was raised not to leave anything, leave your plate clean, right? Don't waste food, waste not, want not. Well, you're definitely taking in more. And if you're not exercising or in some other way accounting for those increased calories, you've seen where it goes. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about some of the things that are related to obesity. We're not going to spend a lot of time on it. Epidemiological studies have shown that obesity is associated with increased rates of some psychiatric disorders. If you think about sort of how this epidemic of body size and body shapes and physical health conditions affecting how that might affect the mind and how that might affect the brain and sort of the evolution of psychiatric disorders. This is a study that looked at the estimates of various kinds of psychiatric disorders if your BMI was less than 30, meaning if you were less than the cutoff for obese, versus if you were greater than 30. And what's clear is that if you ask people over the course of their lifetime, in general, you get a little bit of an increase. So people who are classified as obese, who meet that criteria, have more depression, they have more bipolar disorder, more anxiety disorder, but it's not that much, right? I mean, 18% versus 22%, which means that there's a heck of a lot of individuals who are obese that don't have any increase in psychiatric disorder. So the same is true if you, instead of asking over the course of a lifetime, just over the past year, right? That's why the numbers go down, 8% versus 9.5%. But one critical thing that's important to emphasize is that obesity is not considered to be a mental health disorder, okay? And for the rest of the talk, what we're going to do is we're going to start discussing eating disorders, which are psychiatric disorders that are associated with disruptions in eating behaviors. Okay? In some ways, it's in preparing this talk, I'm a psychiatrist and I'm going to focus on eating disorders, but without having the historical framework for this obesity epidemic and the way that society and culture relates to food, it's a little bit difficult to conceptualize some of these disorders. So let's talk about that for a little bit. So if you look at human society, there are lots of normative behaviors that are considered to be associated with reduced food intake or increased food intake. So religious fasting, right? Fasting during Lent or Ramadan, or some of the Hindu ascetics who would purposely take in as minimal food as necessary just to support life. Gandhi used food restriction as a form of political statement. And there are plenty of instances of feasting in medieval times, even going back to Roman times. And so these were all considered normal. These are not considered in the realm of a psychiatric disorder, but they definitely represent periods of time when behaviors related to food are different than usual. It's also important to think that if there's such a link between food intake and body proportion, it's also important to think about the way that body features have been linked with certain societal ideals of beauty, and mainly for the point of emphasizing just how different features can be emphasized. So there are cultures in Africa that emphasize having a long, slender neck and will try to purposely elongate the necks of women to make them appear more beautiful. There are societies that consider larger figures with more curves to be more beautiful, and other societies, more typically Western societies, smaller figures with less curves. And I'm sure you've seen folks here in Oklahoma and in the US with tattoos and piercings and makeup, which could look very different from the tattoos and piercings and makeup that somebody might be wearing in an Aboriginal tribe. Yet each of these could be considered to be related to societal ideals of beauty, which calls forth this quote about beauty being in the eye of the beholder. In other words, the perception of beauty is something that's subjective and also prone to change. So we're going to start talking about some psychiatric disorders, and I want to make one point of clarification that psychiatry is a branch of medicine that is involved in the treatment of disorders that affect the mind, the brain, and behavior. Disorders are different and distinct from diseases in this way. So symptoms are subjective sense that something physical or mental is abnormal, some sort of feature. It's sort of the reason you go to the doctor. It's the reason you go to the psychologist or the psychiatrist. I have this problem. Or the reason somebody takes you to the clinician, right? My family member has this problem. A disorder is a cluster of co-occurring symptoms that cause some sort of impairment. So there's this thing happening and it's causing problems for me. Whereas a disease is considered differently. It's a disorder, so it's a cluster of symptoms, but it causes impairment in the functioning of the body or one of its parts. So if you think about somebody with diabetes, immediately you might think elevated blood sugar, they have a pancreas that's not functioning properly, they're not releasing insulin enough, or they're not sensitive enough to insulin to process the blood glucose. So we don't have that level of specificity for most of the psychiatric disorders that are around today that we treat, that we study. And so a lot of research that's happening currently, including research at the Laureate Institute, is really focused on trying to see what are some of these biological underpinnings. So if we don't have the biological underpinnings, if we don't have that level of detail about diabetes, then certainly when we discuss a disorder, if it's a cluster of co-occurring symptoms, what if those symptoms change, right? What if something in society changes and the way that human beings relate to these symptoms change? Well, then you could have an evolution of the disorder. So we're going to talk about one disorder that is associated with increased food intake and a higher range of body mass index, and it's called binge eating disorder. Has anybody heard of binge eating disorder? If you have, just raise your hands. So probably about half of you. So binge eating disorder is characterized by these recurrent episodes of eating large amounts of food in a short time period. So this isn't your Thanksgiving feast where you might sort of space it out. This is a large amount of food in a short time period that's associated with feelings of loss of control over what was eaten or how much was eaten. In other words, the amount that's eaten is not considered to have been preferred. The eating occurs either rapidly or until somebody's uncomfortably full. It can happen when people aren't hungry. So if they're not eating to slake their hunger, then what are they eating for? And it's often associated with feelings of guilt or self-disgust or self-loathing. It's not associated with a purging, so the food is not vomited. It's usually not followed by increased efforts to exercise, to burn calories or take laxatives. And it has a specific frequency. And when I talked about disorders changing, it's interesting to me that half of this audience has heard about binge eating disorder because it's only been around since about 1994. So if you've heard of the DSM, this is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. It's a collection of expert consensus about what current psychiatric disorders look like. And it was not recognized as a formal disorder until the DSM-4 in 1994. And when we went from DSM-4 to DSM-5, the frequency criteria changed. So again, how society views these behaviors and how clinicians view these disorders can change over time. How prevalent is BED in the... oops, actually, let me... to give you a little bit more personal perspective, I wanted to show a video about binge eating disorder. So let me see if I can bring this up before we move to the next slide.
Binge eating disorder is eating a large amount of food in a short amount of time. That's sort of the DSM definition. The important part is the feelings and the shame and the embarrassment, everything that comes after the binge. Hearing that diagnosis for me was just so liberating. It was like, wow, you know, this all makes sense now. This is great. I know what I'm dealing with. And so I can move on from here. There are many pathways to obesity, binge eating disorder being one of them. And there are many pathways either out of obesity or living in a body that's larger and accepting that and still being healthy by addressing your health and not a number on a scale. One treatment is not going to work for every individual. Binge eaters need something way beyond diet and exercise. 3% of American women over the age of 18 and 2% men, which is 3 times the number as anorexia and bulimia put together. And they're essentially invisible, and yet they're very visible. They're right in front of us.
So, invisible yet very visible in front of us. I thought that was a really poignant observation. And I think that it's important that BED is increasingly appreciated and increasingly researched as a disorder that's prevalent in the U.S. So, if you look at lifetime estimates, what you see is about 3.5% of females and about 2% of males would meet criteria for this disorder. Mostly people between 18 and 60 for some reason. It's unclear why that is. And even more concerning is that most people actually don't access treatment. So the majority of people are actually not receiving treatment. Only 42.5% receive treatment for this disorder. So I think that's concerning. One thing about treatment is treatment should be targeted towards something, towards an understanding of the disorder. The title of this talk is How Food Rules the Brain, or When Food Rules the Brain. So I want to talk a little bit about some models of how the brain may be altered in BED. And one of these things, one of the aspects of the disorder, it's kind of whenever scientists are making models of these things, you come out with a description of a disorder, and it has different components, and oftentimes in research studies you have to go after a specific component to really understand it well, and then to take a step back. So some of the more popular ways of tackling this disorder right now is by looking at something called inhibitory processing. And I think you'll all know what this means and what this is about. Let me show you how we study it in the lab, and I'll give you an example. So in the lab, people are sitting there and they're waiting for a cue, like an arrow, and as soon as they see the arrow pointing in the right direction, they push a button, right? And that's a trial where they're supposed to go, but you can tell them to reverse that motor decision if they see something, a cue that looks different, right? So you see this and you're supposed to press the button, but then you see this and you say, okay, no, I'm not. And you have to inhibit. And if you successfully inhibit it in time, then you have successful inhibition. But sometimes you're not able to, and you press the button anyways. So one example would be, have you ever sort of noticed that you're on your third or fourth cookie, right? You said, oh, I'll have one cookie. And all of a sudden you're on your second or third, right? Or you jump the gun on a stoplight, right? So scientists have tried to characterize what brain circuits are involved in these kind of inhibitory processes because they believe that that may be a model for the type of binge eating that occurs in which the person feels a loss of self-control over what they're eating and how much they're eating, again, without even feeling hungry. So in terms of some of the neural circuits that have been characterized, I'm not going to give you a neuroanatomy lecture, but suffice to say, if this is the front of the brain and this is the back of the brain, what we see is a lot of involvement of frontal networks, so areas in the prefrontal cortex. Human beings have the largest size of the prefrontal cortex relative to any other species on the planet in terms of body mass. And also these basal ganglia or subcortical networks that have a lot of connections with the frontal cortex. The frontal cortex is involved in complex planning, it's involved in personality, it's involved in temperament. And in the model of binge eating disorder, people have been wondering, is there evidence for impaired inhibition? So there have been a number of studies, and if you recall that obesity is associated with binge eating disorder. First, what people did is they said, well, okay, obesity, if it's a condition of overeating, let's look at inhibitory processing. And this is an example of the data. It's pretty easy to interpret. This is called a forest plot. So basically, each of these rows are individual studies. This is the average of the finding, and this is the spread. But all you need to know is, here's the 0 point, basically, where there's no difference. So if any individual study has a line that crosses that, then it suggests that the study didn't find the effect that was being hypothesized. This diamond here is an aggregate of all of these together, because if you think about, maybe they sampled the wrong group of individuals. Maybe they didn't use the right task in this study. Maybe they used a better one here. So it takes advantage of all of the data that's available from all of the individuals who've been tested. Sometimes these studies are small. In obesity, there seems to be some evidence for differences in inhibitory processing. So that's potentially promising. When you look at binge eating disorder, you have to compare individuals with BED who are obese from those who are not obese, right? Because we know there's an effect of obesity, it's possible that that might be driving the effect. So it turns out when you do this kind of comparison, you actually don't seem to find as much of a difference. So this is one example where people have made a hypothesis about this disorder from the standpoint of some of the symptoms, and they've used some common laboratory tests to try to tease this apart. You'll notice that there's only 3 studies here, whereas in the previous one there was 7 or 8, right? So I wouldn't say at this point that this is a conclusive result, but this is the kind of thing that happens in the scientific process where you have one study that finds something, and then you have more studies that follow it, and you have to look at them in aggregate. In terms of the brain basis of this disorder, I would say that at this point, we don't know as much as we would like. Not surprising, given that it wasn't introduced until 1994. Some of the studies that are looking at other processes relate to something called reward anticipation. So how much are you looking forward to eating the cookie or eating the dessert after dinner? And what has been found is that in one of these subcortical frontal striatal circuits, so this is a region of the brain that's involved in planning and sequencing of motor behaviors, also involved in the processing of reward, that patients with BED have less activity here than patients with obesity. But again, this is only one study, so keep that in mind. In terms of models, this is the kind of model or type of picture that you'll see when you look at papers that review. And I don't want to go into the details of every individual brain structure. I want you to focus on this thing right here, which says reward motivation, and it has some colors associated with different regions of the brain, and inhibitory control, and habitual behavior. And I want to point out that at this point, what neuroscientists and psychiatrists are trying to do is to take what they understand about certain parts of the brain and how that might relate to psychiatric symptoms, and then study those areas in isolation and also in connection. So if you think about these general processes, it's not too hard to see how they relate to food, right? So food might be is inherently rewarding. You also need it to survive, but sweet foods are appreciated more than unsweet or foul-tasting foods. At some point, you have to stop eating, and it can be easy to develop a habit about eating. It can be easy to even without a disorder, realize that you've come to that second or third cookie. Another thing I want to point out with this brain region, the insular cortex, which we'll come back to, is when you eat, you actually have to ingest the food, right? It becomes a part of your body, right? You chew, you swallow, you have a sensation of liquid or solid going down your esophagus, and it hits your stomach. If you've ever had a cold glass of water or milk on a hot day, you know that feeling of coolness in the pit of your stomach. The insula is one of these brain regions that is involved in processing both the taste of food, but also the feeling as it enters your body. And it's a very important area for processing other kinds of sensations related to the body, the inner body in particular, something called interoception. And we'll return to that later, but I just want to emphasize again that in this disorder, it's one in which there's a conceptualization of multiple brain regions that are part of different circuits that are interacting. Okay. In terms of a model for how this might work in binge eating disorder, this is one example of a hypothetical model where in the normal circumstance, when you have everything working normally, you have circuits in the frontal cortex and the subcortical striatal areas interacting. You have complex actions of stimulation and inhibition that result in normal eating behavior. And there are hypotheses about dysfunctions in the connection between some of these regions. So you can see a solid line here and a dashed line here, where the thought is that maybe something about the brain's ability to inhibit behavior, so decreased cortical inhibition, and maybe paying more attention to food, maybe noticing, being more prone to, say, noticing the cookie, or being more prone to think about food, being more prone to liking the experience of eating food, yet somehow not being as rewarded by it, if you think about the imaging study, on a background of genetic environmental risk factors. So the hypothesis in this particular model is that all of these things collectively result in disruption in these circuits that lead to increases in impulsive behavior and compulsive eating in binge eating disorder. Now, everything I said there, it's all, at this point, a model, right? Which is it's what we think about how the brain functions in these disorders. It's not complete, and we need more evidence. That being said, has that stopped scientists and clinicians from trying to develop treatments? Definitely not, right? If you have a treatment and it works, even if you don't know why it works, that could help people. So there are a number of treatments that target the brain, and many of these are actually experimental. So I'm going to describe a couple, but by no means are the results conclusive. So just keep that in mind. This is more for in terms of things that you may have heard about on the radio or things that you may hear about in the future. So has anybody heard of transcranial magnetic stimulation? Okay. So much less people, about 2 people. So transcranial magnetic stimulation, or TMS, is provided from a device that looks like this. When you put it on the scalp, what happens is the device runs magnetic pulses rhythmically, and this is an example of a magnetic field. And because of the Lorentz law of physics, when you run a cyclical magnetic field in a certain direction, you actually have an electrical field in the perpendicular direction. So all that means is you can actually stimulate, you can excite or activate brain tissue, or you can suppress the activity of it. So in this model here, this person is receiving TMS to a region of the brain that probably corresponds to the prefrontal cortex, one of the areas that in the reviews people think may be implicated in binge eating disorder. And if you increase or decrease the level of activity, could you disrupt some of the symptoms that a person with BED might be experiencing? That's the general notion. This TMS has been around for less than 20 years, although for some other areas of psychiatry, it's already approved by the FDA for treatment. So example, in depression, it's approved for treatment. There are even some insurance providers who will reimburse for it, though it's expensive. So when I was preparing for this talk, I wanted to see how far along the literature was, and it turns out there's really not much. So there's one study that's underway. This is an example of, this is a publication where the design of the study was released, and the study is currently the data is being collected, it's not available, so this is sort of like the preview for the movie, if you will. Really, this is kind of the state of the art with binge eating disorder in terms of this type of therapy. There are other treatments as well that involve modulation of brain. So has anyone heard of transcranial direct current stimulation, or TDCS? Raise your hand if you have. I see all the LIBR folks have. This also involves electricity to try to modulate brain activity, but in a different way. So rather than using frequent pulses, literally there's a battery right here, and there's a positive and a negative terminal, right, just like you see on batteries. And there's a very, very weak electrical current that is passed along here. And that current not just goes along the scalp, but it goes through the frontal cortex. Okay? And it seems to modulate the level of activity in the brain. People are studying it in relation to anxiety and depression. This is a study that was reporting some effects in relation to craving for different types of foods in BED. So in this particular study, when these people were wearing the device and they were actually being stimulated here in the black, their craving was reduced for these kinds of foods. Their desire for their liking and their wanting for those foods was less. And this is an example of, in another setting in that study, that those people actually seemed to eat a little bit less calories as well. So again, this is one study, but it's an example of the kinds of research that's happening in this country and the kind of information that you may find out more about. So to summarize about binge eating disorder, it's a relatively new psychiatric disorder. It's often associated with obesity. There are models that involve frontal and subcortical brain circuits that focus on impulsivity and inhibition of habitual responses. And we're really just beginning to target and modulate the activity of this circuit using non-invasive methods to try to understand it. So I'm going to shift to, and I'm probably going to go a little bit quicker, to talk about a different kind of eating disorder. So we talked about an eating disorder that is on the more obese end of the spectrum. Next, we're going to talk about an eating disorder that's on the underweight end of the spectrum. One that I know all of you have heard about, called anorexia nervosa. So raise your hand if you have not heard of this disorder. Yeah, so nobody. So, it's unclear whether anorexia nervosa has been around for all of time. There's really not a lot of great descriptions about this. I told you that binge eating disorder was first recognized as a disorder in 1994. When you look through the records, you'll find references to different types of fasting behaviors. You'll find references to Egyptian hieroglyphs relating to food restriction. But in terms of the first kind of concrete recognition within a clinical setting, that really didn't happen until 1684, which was actually the same year that Newton's laws of motion and gravitation were being described and validated. So Dr. Richard Morton, a medical doctor in London, was referred a patient who had previously looked like this, for example, and who had become very despondent, had lost her appetite, had some poor digestion. He described that her flesh seemed to be flaccid and loose. He did not remember ever seeing a patient with such a wasted degree of what he described as consumption at that time, tuberculosis, right? He described it as a skeleton only clad with skin, right? So this might have been, this isn't a picture of the exact patient, but this may have been what she looked like. He tried treating her with all the medicines that he had available, and she didn't really respond. She got tired of them, and didn't really want any more treatment, and after 3 months, she died. So that was in 1684. Following that, in the late 1800s, a couple physicians, an English physician and a French physician, started to see some of these cases more systematically, actually gave this set of descriptions or set of symptoms, right? A name, a disorder name, anorexia nervosa, described some characteristics including extreme thinness, but despite that, sometimes there would be binge eating. Sometimes there'd be binge eating and purging, so self-inducing vomiting. Heightened anxiety, heightened restlessness, and increased physical activity. And since the 1800s, an increasing number was described. In the 1900s, this is a direct quote from the early 1900s, questioning whether we could call it an epidemic or whether there's an increase on the rise. They couldn't say. That actually echoes some of what you'll find if you read the literature today. It's been somewhat hard to get reliable prevalence estimates over time, particularly when the disorder is changed. But if you look at the scientific study of it, it's definitely been increasing. So this is a figure just showing a very rough map of, if you put in the scientific version of Google and you search for all the articles published on anorexia nervosa, you can see they've been going up. Okay? So hopefully that signifies progress. Here's that graph again. If you look for major depression, you see a similar type of graph. This dip relates to a change in terminology, but this essentially is kind of the same, except for one difference. If you look at the number of articles, it's very different, right? So 6,000 in the past year on depression, roughly, versus 600. on anorexia nervosa. If you account for that, this is kind of the relative difference, right? So not as much research going on in depression as depression, and it's something the federal government has advocated for and has tried to make more funding available for. It's really understudied at this point. So what do we know about it? If you look at the current diagnostic criteria, you'll see severe food restriction that causes weight loss, intense fears of gaining weight or feeling fat. So these are patients who, when they look at food, or the idea of eating food, they get anxious. They feel terrible about it. They have a disturbed body image. So they look at themselves in the mirror, and when everybody sees somebody who's very slender, they see somebody who's obese or overweight or not what they want to see. Okay? Very classic finding. If you look at the prevalence estimates in the US, it's very clear that it's a 10-to-1 female to male, and that's true across other countries. In any given year, about 0.4% of females will meet the criteria for the disorder, and lifetime only up to 1%. So it's certainly less prevalent than something like depression, and that might in some ways explain why it hasn't been studied as much. But no less cause for concern, especially when most people aren't actually getting treatment. So in terms of what we know about it, I'm going to summarize a lot by saying it seems to involve genetic, biological, sociological, sociocultural factors that contribute to susceptibility. Some things that have been observed repeatedly: elevated levels of anxiety, perfectionism, and obsessiveness. If you interview these patients in a clinical setting, a lot of times they won't just have anorexia nervosa. They will be diagnosed with OCD or body dysmorphic disorder or a different type of anxiety disorder. And so it raises some questions about the degree to which these are distinct entities relative versus some process occurring in different circuits in the brain in one individual, and an overlapping but somewhat distinct set of circuits in another. And that's not very well understood at this point. Other things that are clear is that, again, it's not just how these people see themselves on the outside in terms of when they look in the mirror, but also throughout the clinical characterization. These are patients who report feeling bloated even after eating a small meal. They report constipation. They report uncomfortable internal body sensations that are bothersome, that preoccupy them. And so in some ways, you could imagine this as a disorder where the way they see themselves externally and internally is abnormal. The other thing is that it's deadly. It has among the highest mortality rates of all psychiatric disorders. So that very first patient that I described who died, that has not been an uncommon finding across many psychiatric descriptions of AN, and so if the rate is the highest, then we should be doing everything we can to study it.
Eating disorders may have the highest death rate of any behavioral disorder, and 5 to 10% of people or more with anorexia and bulimia may die from these disorders. Binge eating disorder is kind of an emerging kind of concept. These are often people that they binge, they don't purge, they do gain a bit of weight, and they often have anxiety and depression. The evidence is overwhelming that there's a very powerful neurobiology that's creating eating disorders. There may be a lot of genes working together that may change the function of a brain neural pathway that then creates a vulnerability for eating disorders.
So I like that quote in that video because it emphasizes some of the complexity of this disorder and also talks a little bit about binge eating disorder. So Dr. K has worked for a long time on understanding the neurobiology of anorexia nervosa. He's a collaborator and a mentor to some of us here at the Laureate Institute. And this is an example of a model that both he and Martin Paulus, the scientific director here, provided to try to understand some of the characteristics that may be associated with AN. So we know AN is a disorder that arises typically in adolescence. We know that a lot is happening around puberty, brain development, your hormones are changing, there are lots of stresses. There can be cultural factors, right? I talked about this beauty ideal and how different cultures view beauty. There's a lot of debate about whether the rates of AN are higher in Western civilizations versus non-Western cultures in terms of this thinness ideal. But whatever it is, it's clear that there are a lot of factors, a lot of traits that somebody who develops the disorder carries with them. So obsessive-compulsive traits, a sense that they must be thin. Perfectionism is quite common, a tendency to see oneself negatively, and also this thing called interoceptive awareness, a heightened sense of how sensations are affecting the body. And in this model, it's described that oftentimes when somebody starts dieting or they lose weight for one reason or another, it triggers a cycle that interacts with all these factors. So one individual that I interviewed recently who was a part of our research studies was talking about her onset of AN, and she was saying that she had some aversion to eating. She had some picky feeding behaviors, but it wasn't until when she was 16, when she had her wisdom teeth removed, and she couldn't eat for a period of time, that she started to lose weight. And she realized, she said, wow, this feels good. It helps. It gave me something to focus on. And in her example, she had a history of some traumas, and so she felt like she was distracted from the traumas, and the lack of food made her feel good. So she tried to keep going and try to prolong that feeling. Eventually it went away, and she would try to keep getting back there. She would exercise more, she would restrict her intake more and more, and you can see that this cycle of weight loss, it didn't address her anxiety or depression. She could not see how she saw herself in the mirror as changing when other people could. There have to be neurobiological changes. And so the thought is that there's a vicious cycle here. Some people will end up going to recovery, but a substantial proportion remain in this chronic illness state. So there are if this is sort of a model of some of the processes, there are brain models. And in this kind of model, a lot of studies in AN have looked at what happens when somebody who's unaffected with the disorder sees food or tastes food, right? If it's a disorder of eating, of restricted intake, then what brain circuits are active when we normally eat and when we normally look at food and experience food, when we process signals inside the body, versus when we have somebody with anorexia nervosa. And if the valuation, the way of relating to food is positive in the healthy state but negative, what are the interactions among these circuits that can drive somebody and tip the balance into them wanting to stay thin rather than simply satisfy their hunger? So this is by no means the only model or the most comprehensive model, but I think, again, just seeing examples of how these models are integrated into research is helpful. In terms of treatment, they are definitely impacting treatment. So now if I asked any of you whether you've heard of TMS, raise your hands. Yay. Okay. Or TDCS. Okay. So these are a number of non-invasive brain modulation therapies that are being studied for anorexia nervosa. fMRI neurofeedback, which I'm not going to talk about today, is something that we actually have. We are actually studying at the Laureate Institute for brain research. We're using it in studies of depression, but others are investigating this for anorexia nervosa. There are ways of stimulating the brain that are more invasive even, deep brain stimulation. There are also ways of stimulating the body using something called vagal nerve stimulation, which I won't talk about, but suffice to say it's a nerve that sends information about the inner state of the body to the brain. So if there's a way to get into the brain, from the brain or the body, people are trying to take advantage of how these technologies impact different brain circuits to improve symptoms of anorexia nervosa. I'm going to skip over a lot of this. This is a study that, one study of TMS that showed some evidence of a response. It's not very overwhelming. Deep brain stimulation is a very invasive form, so you actually insert a battery inside somebody's body with leads that go to electrodes that pinpoint an exact region of the brain and stimulate it or inhibit it. And it's been very effective for Parkinson's disease, and people are investigating it for forms of depression and also for anorexia nervosa and a number of other conditions. So this is an example of just the number of sites that you could pick to stimulate. Obviously, you can't hit all of those without interfering significantly with somebody's brain. This is an example, though, of a patient with anorexia nervosa who had deep brain stimulation applied to this particular region of the brain. And at this point, there's really no large-scale studies. There's one trial of 6 patients. There are some ongoing randomized trials, but there's not a lot. You'd be hard-pressed to get somebody to agree to do this if they hadn't exhausted all other treatments. Okay. So I just wanted to finish by bringing this a little closer to home and talk about how the Laureate Institute for Brain Research, or LIBR, is contributing to this effort. So there's a number of different ways that we can better understand how food rules or affects the brain. One is we can just conduct research into the basic underlying neurobiology. So this is an example of a study from Dr. Kyle Simmons' lab, who's a principal investigator here at LIBR, looking at what are some of the changes in the brain that are associated with simply paying attention to your body. So if individuals with AN see the outside of their body differently, and maybe they see the inside of their body differently, well, what areas of the brain are responsible for those different internal or interoceptive body perceptions? And so this was a paper that was very recently published from his lab, showing that when individuals with AN paid attention to sensations related to the inner body, but particularly the stomach, there were differences in the region of the insula, the one that I talked about before that is related to processing inner body sensations. And in another area of the insula, when they paid attention to the heart, right? So that provides some evidence of the role of this brain region potentially in the disorder. Other ways is we can actually do research into symptom perception, so understanding how individuals perceive their body, because in some ways, even though I said that it seems to be a part of the disorder, apart from clinicians advocating this, there have not been a lot of great controlled studies. So we did a study looking at meal-related sensations of the body. And what we found is that when we modulated the body for healthy individuals, we could increase the way that they felt inner body sensations, in this case, breathing and heartbeat sensations. In this case, we used a drug. But when we didn't actually modulate the body, they also reported feeling something. So when we used a placebo in a double-blinded way. So it provides evidence that attend more and report more sensations even when there's not something changing. And we suspected this because when we repeated this in a post-meal condition, we did not see evidence for that report. So we think that it indicates that individuals with AN, that the pre-meal period, knowing that you're about to eat food, knowing that the food is coming, if you have a fear of food and a fear of fatness, that it has something to do with anxiety, and that it may put you in a state where you are less able to eat or feel comfortable eating. I'm going to skip that. So we can also look at anxiety about food specifically. So when we used the same model to induce anxiety, we didn't find any difference in anxiety related to the drug, but in the patients, we found a change. So before, so after they ate the meal, their anxiety lessened in this dashed line here. Another thing is that you can see is that patients with AN have a higher level of anxiety at baseline. If you just ask somebody with AN, what's your level of anxiety right now? They're at a 2 out of 10 or more all the time. And so if we could get this level of anxiety down and also shrink the amount of meal-related anxiety that they feel, could that actually result in a change in their eating behavior? Could that result in an increase in their ability to eat food, to maintain a normal body weight? Could that help to change how they relate to the process of eating? So the last way, before I close, is that we're also developing novel treatments that we can study to see how they impact symptoms of the disorder. So we're developing actively treatments that we want to study to see if we can reset or retune these abnormal perceptions about the body and about anxiety in AN. To address this key question, how can we make the experience of eating less anxiety-provoking for individuals with AN? There are 2 studies that we're running right now. If you're affected by or if you know anyone with the disorder, the first study involves repeated exposure to restricted environmental stimulation or floating, which is a study that is being conducted in collaboration with Dr. Justin Feinstein, who has created and is developing the Float Clinic and Research Center here. So has anybody heard about floating? Okay. Okay, so in this day and age, our brains are constantly and increasingly bombarded by external environmental stimulation, right? Whether it's radios, cell phones, texting, Facebook, Twitter, internet. If you're a physician, your pager. It's in some ways nearly impossible to disconnect from these influences. And to do so requires an increasing amount of effort. When I was in high school, there were no pagers and there were no cell phones. And then people started to get pagers, and then people started to get cell phones, and then you'd be in a conversation with them, and then they'd get a call, and then they'd answer it, right? So in this day and age, it's become increasingly difficult. Just think about if you use email for work, how compelling it is, the drive to keep checking your email, to see what the updates are, or your Facebook feeds. And so it can be really difficult nowadays to get apart or separate or disentangle yourself from those influences and just experience the mind and the body in a state of rest, where you're not pulled in one direction or another. So floating provides an opportunity to do that. And what does it feel like? It's really hard to describe. One example would be this, I guess. I've been talking to you for over an hour, and I can just stop. But that's not really going to do it any justice. And if you really want to find out, I would encourage you to try it. In terms of what we think about from a neurobiological or from a brain perspective, this is a slide that I've borrowed directly from Dr. Feinstein. So I've been showing you pictures of the brain, and let's assume this is the brain with the skull removed. Floating, it provides an environment where you can attenuate some of the sensations and the information coming in. So if you were to float, you go into a room with a pool of water where you can turn the lights out, so you can attenuate information coming to your visual system. It's a soundproof room, so information coming into your auditory system is attenuated. It is a pool of water. It's only about 11 inches deep. That's filled with about 2,000 pounds of Epsom salt, so more salt than the Dead Sea. So when you lie in it, unlike your pool or your bathtub, there's no need to hold your breath to stay afloat. No need to move your muscles to swim. So the sense of your body in space and any sort of movement and any sort of sensation, if you remain completely still, you've attenuated a lot of those sensory signals. It's quiet, and there's nothing to do, so you're not producing any speech. In terms of what this does to the brain, we don't exactly know, but it doesn't take a neuroscientist, and Dr. Feinstein says this all the time, to figure out that this must be doing something, right? One of the things that we're very interested in, and we've been conducting studies, if you see what's left, so there's a broad swath of the prefrontal cortex, and there's information about the inner state of the body that's still coming in, right? There's no light and there's no sound, so there's nothing coming to you from the outside. There's no mirror. You're not looking at yourself, but you're still feeling the body, and you still have your mind. And so what is that all about? How does it affect people? It is an increasingly popular form of activity in this country. You can go to the LIBOR website and go to Dr. Feinstein's webpage to learn more about it. But we're actively studying it. One thing that people seem to report is that there's a sense of reduction in stress, an increase in feelings of relief, a reduction in anxiety. We don't know the extent to which that holds in different disorders. But people report also feeling changes in how they perceive their body. And most importantly, it's an intervention which people perceive positively in the sense that kind of like a massage, right? So there are float centers that are opening up all over the country. There are several in Tulsa. And people are paying to go have this experience all over the country and actually all over the world. And in some cases, there are definitely patients who are experiencing this. Patients with eating disorders, patients with anxiety disorders, patients with mood disorders, patients with binge eating disorder. And we don't really know how it's affecting them in terms of their symptoms and in terms of their brain function. And so we're really actively investigating the impact that this has. This is what floating actually looks like. So I described, should have maybe done it the other way around. I described it, but this is what it looks like in the pool at the Laureate Institute. We have a circular pool. It's one of the largest pools in the country and in the world, completely open, and very different. If you read about online, there's a history of different kinds of float devices. Most of them were enclosed and kind of looked like coffins, very enclosed. And so we have an open pool. And what we're doing is we're investigating the impact of floating in anorexia nervosa. And we're looking, this is a safety study that we're actively enrolling for. Because first, we need to know that it's safe. We know that individuals with AN, sometimes when they stand up, they can feel dizzy. We don't want to have, the last thing we would want is for somebody to come to harm from being exposed to one of these interventions. Eventually, we are interested in looking at aspects of anxiety and body image. But really, right now, we're really investigating the safety of this as we decide on more kinds of studies. So we have another study, which I'm going to skip. I just want to conclude today by saying that that I've talked about a couple disorders, but there are a lot of them. These are all the different types of eating and feeding disorders in the diagnostic and statistical definitions. And so I want you to keep that in mind in terms of all the different ways that food may affect the brain and eating behaviors may affect brain function in these conditions. We talked about a lot of different treatments. Just like any condition, there are going to be treatments that are preventive, that are less invasive, that can be helpful for less severe forms of the condition, and then more invasive ones. And so we talked about more invasive, we talked about deep brain stimulation and transcranial magnetic stimulation. We didn't talk about the most common forms of treatment, which is medication and psychotherapy, which are the mainstays. But I didn't talk about them because I think that it's important to get a sense of where the field may be going, to give you a sense of how we think about the brain in relation to these disorders. And if you are affected by or know somebody with a condition, if they get treatment, that's what they're going to receive, medication and psychotherapy. We talked about neuromodulation, we talked about floating. Anytime you consider any therapy, this is what you're trying to balance, right? Acceptability, which should be high. Hopefully invasiveness would be low. We talked about deep brain stimulation. Most people don't want to have neurosurgery to treat their depression or their anxiety. Same with an eating disorder. You want something that's not necessarily very technical, that can be reversed, hopefully that doesn't cost very much, most importantly that works, and can be applied in a variety of contexts to maybe other disorders. So I want to thank all the collaborators, especially Martin Paulus, the scientific director at LIBOR, Dr. Feinstein, Dr. Simmons, as well as the members of my lab who are an important support for the research that we're doing. And I'm happy to take your questions. Yeah.
You mentioned that people have sometimes at least have an internal perception, and you mentioned some specific like constipation.
Yeah.
Are there actual clinical observations of constipation, or is it just a sensation of constipation?
Yeah, it's a good question. So, oh yeah. So the question was in anorexia nervosa. With the reports of, frequent reports of internal body sensations like constipation, is there any evidence of constipation that would support that kind of report? So the short answer is no. You know, there are, when you think about the constipation and also just the gastrointestinal system, you know, it's like a 24-foot tube that goes from tip to, you know, top to bottom, right? And so individuals with anorexia nervosa have reported, it's not necessarily a generalization, but it's not uncommon for them to report having difficulty swallowing. So often they'll get swallow studies, or to have stomach pain or bloating or constipation, which is generally comes from the large intestine, right? Sort of below the stomach. And so people have looked at whether the rate of stomach contraction is different. the rate of swallowing, whether the quality of stool, the frequency, and all those kinds of things. And at this point, there's not conclusive evidence to suggest that there is a systematic difference. It doesn't mean that there couldn't be some people that can't also develop constipation, right? But in terms of, it's not considered to be part of the diagnostic properties of the disorder. But it's tricky because I think that right now this disturbance in inner body perception has not been integrated into the categorization of the disorder. It's not one of the recognized symptoms that becomes a cluster of symptoms in the disorder, and I think it should be. But the problem is that it's much easier to study external body image disturbance, right? You just put a mirror in front of somebody or you show them some figures of different shapes than it is to actually study how they process the inside of the body. So those studies which we're doing here at LIBOR are very intricate. They're sometimes invasive, but that, and I gave you an example of that with the drug that we use to change heartbeat and breathing sensations. But it gives you the level of assurance that you know what's happening in the body when you compare the body to the subjective report. And that's really the best way to assure an answer to that question. Yes?
Well, I find myself wondering if you're talking about the binge eating disorder. There is commonalities in the neural circuits for that. And addictions, like alcohol or nicotine or heroin.
Yeah, definitely. And that's a point that came up as I was researching this, and also a point that I forgot to make. So I thank you for raising it. So the question was, to what degree are some of the brain the abnormalities in brain circuits in binge eating disorder similar to other disorders of addiction? So there's a lot of overlap in those circuits. When you look at the prefrontal lobe, when you look at different aspects of prefrontal cortex, when you look at the striatum, those subcortical circuits, when you look at areas of the brain involved in processing reward, they're all implicated in, they're often all implicated in addiction, binge eating disorder, and other disorders as well. And it's a I think in some ways it challenges the way that psychiatry has looked at some of these disorders, because I don't think there's a sense that these disorders are living as in separate regions of the brain exclusively. I mean, these are processes, right? Food is a rewarding process. Drugs are rewarding processes, right? Cocaine is an inherently pleasure-inducing stimulus the same way that food is. Even with obesity, people also have been looking at the same circuits, not for binge eating disorder, but just for obesity, and trying to look at how inhibitory control are involved, how interoception is involved, how decision-making is involved. And so what it has prompted is a change in the way that psychiatry relates to these disorders. So in some ways you could say, well, let's not look at addiction or binge eating or obesity. Let's look at reward processing. And let's find people who have abnormalities in how they process reward. And then let's see what brain circuitry is involved or how it's abnormal. And then let's look back at whether they've had any disorders or what impact it's had on their function in other areas. So if you looked for evidence in similarities in the brain between obesity, addiction, binge eating disorder, you're going to find it. And it doesn't necessarily mean that these are the same disorders, And it doesn't necessarily mean that the exact same process is abnormal in the brain, but you could probably make some inferences about the degree to which similar circuits are being involved. It's a good question. You had a question.
What would you say the differences are really in the outcomes between floating and, say, meditation or some other methods?
Yeah. So that would be a great question for Dr. Feinstein, and it's one that I know that he's going to be addressing later on this year at a contemplative sciences conference. So I've studied the effects of meditation on interoception in the past. I did my Ph.D. research on that. And I think one thing that I can say is that there are lots of people who meditate, but not everybody finds it to be the easiest thing to do. Not a lot of people have, at this point, have experience with just sitting down and doing nothing. And if you do yoga, or if you do yoga and meditation, that involves oftentimes engaging the mind in very different ways. You might be doing mantras. You might be expending effort to maintain a body posture. And so you might be doing some similar things, but you're also going to be doing other aspects related to that practice. And so some people have described floating as a shortcut to meditation, which I don't believe. But I do think that it provides an environment that is conducive to having the experience of something that's different from what your day-to-day life is. It could be meditative. If you look at the science on meditation, what people describe it as in a research setting is the self-regulation of attention. So you choose to do something with your mind when you're meditating, whether it's to do nothing or to do a mantra or to focus your attention on the unconditional positive well-being of everyone in the planet, right? You're still doing a cognitive activity. And with floating, if you go to a float center, you will float. And there may be an instruction, but there may not be. And so I know that that's an area that we're also investigating in terms of how to consider those differences. But you should really talk to Dr. Feinstein for more. Yeah?
Do you know of any research that involves hypnosis?
Do I know any research that is involved in hypnosis and eating disorders? I have not read any direct studies myself. I have not looked into the literature on that. I'm sure that it has been done. Certainly in psychiatry, you name it, and people have tried it. In my clinical practice as a psychiatrist and in my training in residency, I never came across anyone who used it, including eating disorder experts. So I don't feel like I can comment on the whether it has some efficacy in the condition. Yes. Sure.
The incidence rate, I guess, is probably highest in infection. I guess highest at puberty. And has anyone done a study to see what the youngest age is, or if there is a significant population prior to puberty would experience anorexia?
Right. Yeah. I mean, there are definitely lots of examples of patients who developed full-blown symptoms of AN prior to puberty. In other words, symptoms at 8, 9, 10, 7. It typically is around the time of puberty, but there's also lots of instances where it's well after puberty. And so I think that peripubertal or timing is something that has made people think about the role that that hormones play in changing the structure and function of the brain. But I think that as with a lot of these disorders, they're complex, and there might even be instances where you could say that in one person you think that it has everything to do with their disorder, and another person that it has nothing to do. So I would say that it seems to play a role, but not necessarily a defining role as a rule. Other questions?
How are we doing with efficacy in I'm going to put a punchline on like the wires and all the really invasive versus anti-emetic stuff? We're doing ink when it comes to cognitive and
Right.
traditional medicine. We're not doing much for either one. And anorexia is less of a problem, although far more deadly than obesity. That my goodness, we have a problem with obesity and
Right. Yeah, so the question was, how good are we doing in terms of the efficacy or the effectiveness of all of these treatments? And if you look at conventional treatments for anorexia nervosa, like medication, they tend to not perform very well. That doesn't mean that they won't be used. Cognitive behavioral therapy and other forms of psychotherapy, family-based therapy, those have definitely shown efficacy. In other words, they have definitely been shown to help with symptoms. In terms of the neuromodulation, we're very early on. It's really, in some cases, the studies haven't even been done. And so I think it's I think the sort of the floating approach and then the brain stimulation approach give a nice range of perspectives on non-invasive versus invasive and sort of thinking outside the box approaches. There are lots of new medications and new psychotherapies that are under investigation as well, but I think that in terms of conceptualizing the whole picture, I think I wanted to focus on that for today's talk. Any other? Yes. Did you have a question? Oh, okay. Okay, you get the last question.
Is there a genetic, has anyone identified a genetic locus for anorexia?
There, in small studies, there have been genetic loci that were identified. The largest study that would actually be powered to search the entire genome is ongoing. So in other words, there are some studies that have been done looking at, say, like families that have a clearly elevated rate of anorexia nervosa, and there are some genetic abnormalities that have been found. I don't think it's worth going into the details on those because we don't know to what extent those would apply to the whole population. The study that I mentioned is called the ANGI study, the Anorexia Nervosa Genetics Initiative. And it's part of a broader movement within psychiatry to try to collect genetic samples from almost the entire population, or the largest sample possible, so that rather than focusing on subregions of the genome, you can take all the information, put it in a computer, and crunch it, apply some statistical tests, and see what comes out without putting in any hypotheses of your own. And I think the results from that study will be interesting, but the caution I'll even provide there is that I think the number of samples they're up to is around 14 or 16,000 samples, whereas when you compare similar studies in schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, the sample sizes there are well over 100,000. And in those studies, there have been abnormalities that have been found, but there were more similarities between bipolar disorder and schizophrenia than there were differences. So I think that these are powerful methods, but if you think about the overall scale of what it takes to answer some of these questions, it can be daunting too. So. Okay. Thank you very much for coming and braving the storm. Appreciate it.